My name is Chris Adams. I'm Director of Training at the National Press Foundation. We're thankful for all of you being here. We're going to turn to our first speaker. Yukon Huang is a former World Bank Country Director for China and is a Senior Fellow in the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he researches the Chinese economy. He's going to give us an overview of what this term techno-nationalism means, how big of a threat or how big of an issue it actually is, and kind of what it, he's going to give us the wide parameters of what the topic means. And Alex is going to drill into one particular industry, semiconductors, and give us a case study on that. And Martin Rasser is going to talk about some of the steps that the U.S. and other countries and multilateral agreements might be taking or should be taking to kind of deal with techno-nationalism. So we're going to turn it over to Yukon right now. So Yukon, thank you very much for being with us. And the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be with you here. As Chris mentioned, techno-nationalism features very prominently in the U.S.-China trade and investment tensions. Very simply, it's linking a country's technical capabilities to national security and prosperity. So from a Washington perspective, the rise of China's technological and innovative capacity is seen as a threat to America's dominance as the global great power. And this shows up in the trade war, and in what aspect? Let me just go to the first slide. Okay. But if you look at the issue from Beijing's perspective, Beijing's always asking, what is it that Washington really wants? And the answer is quite complicated. It's complicated because from Washington's perspective, there's three constituents. You have President Trump. His major concern is about trade deficits. China accounts for the bulk of America's huge trade deficits. And he basically wants Beijing or China to buy more soybeans, aircraft, energy products, whatever. And this is his focus. Most economists think that the focus on trade deficits actually doesn't matter. America's been running a trade deficit every year for 45 years. It has a bilateral trade deficit with more than 100 countries. That's not prevented America from being the strongest economic power globally. So from a perspective of what I call the economists, it's not really about trade. The second constituent is the business community. They want a greater access to China's domestic market. They worry about unfair competition. They claim that they're being forced to transfer technology to be able to invest in China. They want greater protection of intellectual property rights. I think there's a lot of legitimate issues here, and China's trying to struggle to deal with these concerns. But the first contradiction I'd like to point out is that if you actually Beijing actually responds to the concerns of the business community, the trade deficit actually will get larger rather than smaller. So in some sense, President Trump's focus is larger on trade and less on the unfair foreign investment policies. Then you have the third constituents, and the focus of today's discussions. These are what I would call the foreign policy security hawks. For them, the relationship with China is a great power battle for technological supremacy. So they worry about the fact that China's innovative capacity is increasing dramatically, and this is basically a threat to America's dominant position. There's a problem here. If the security hawks get their way, they would favor decoupling, separation of the two economies, preventing China from getting access to America's high-tech production. But this runs directly counter to the business community because the business community wants greater access. In some sense, they favor greater integration. So there's a contradiction between what I would call the security hawks and the business community. The business community is concerned largely with the fact that China is exceptional in adopting technology. This is a graph produced by the World Bank. Technology adoption intensity is a coefficient which measures how successful a country is in getting technology developed abroad, particularly the US and the West, and then being able to use it domestically. And it's a lag about 10 to 15 years. And you can see, starting from about 2 or 3 decades ago, China became extraordinarily successful in its ability to get technology from overseas, to use it, to produce, to export, better than any country we've seen. And how do you get it? You get it through trade, you get it through foreign investment, licensing, and of course, accusations that China gets it through theft and unfair competition. So America's response, And this is a diagram that was put up by America's security establishment in a briefing seminar several months ago. And basically what they see is a whole government trying to approach to acquiring technology from America through investments, academic collaboration, cybersecurity, joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions, all sorts of potential approaches to secure technologies from the United States. And what is the response? This is a chart that summarizes what I would call the various elements of the techno-nationalism war. On the far left, you can see that basically America is looking at it through trade policies, investment policies, the flow of people, research collaboration. And they're using for trade tariffs, an entity list, meaning basically these companies cannot buy, purchase American high-tech equipment, who controls of exports, what can be shipped abroad, and import restrictions. In terms of foreign investment, we have CFIUS, a regulatory agency which reviews foreign investment to make sure that China and other countries don't have access to high-tech investments in equipment and knowledge. America is starting to limit equity, financial flows to China, and they're getting to be visa restrictions, concerns about counter-espionage and research collaboration. The impact is broad. You see declining trade between US and China. You see bans of exports to Huawei and ZTE and AI companies, declining foreign direct investment going both ways, decoupling of financial markets, visa decline, denials, declining tourism. The consequence is self-sufficiency on both sides, national security concerns becoming more dominant, you have greater uncertainty, erosion of trust, and you have reduced growth on both sides. Very comprehensive, negative kind of relationship is emerging. Here's an illustration of Huawei. Suppose you take Huawei and you see there's a threat, particularly in its 5G operations. So Huawei basically draws upon high-tech components produced from a variety of companies all over the world. So the light red is basically Chinese companies, but the dark blue are basically American companies. And you can see how many American companies actually export high-tech equipment to Huawei. And then there's one here, I would like to point this one out here, this TSMC, that's Taiwan. Taiwan is a major producer of semiconductors, and America has just basically approached TSMC to basically say you should be investing and transferring your capacity to America, but not particularly trying to, no longer can you be exporting equipment, semiconductors to Huawei. So this is basically a restriction. You want to decouple, and the impact upon Huawei is potentially very serious. But it also has an impact upon America's high-tech companies. So here are America's high-tech companies and other companies. What share of the revenues come from China? And so you see the high-tech companies like Qualcomm, Micron, Broadcom, Intel, everything, they get anywhere from maybe 10, 20, as much as 50, 60% of the revenues from China. If they're no longer able to export products to China, their profitability would be severely reduced. And from a Defense Department perspective, they've actually wondered whether or not putting up these restrictions in order to preserve America's security actually does the reverse, that America loses the capacity to produce high-tech equipment and components. And actually, this is sort of like a self-fulfilling negative policy to restrict exports of high-tech equipment to China. Supply chains are shifting because of these restrictions, these tariffs, these export-import restrictions. Companies are starting to relocate from China. Major firms, however, will likely maintain a major presence in China for commercial reasons, but some will establish regional centers. Whatever, the implementation will take many years. Decoupling will put downward pressure on investment, heighten uncertainties, the impact of greater for manufacturing than for services catered to China's domestic markets. Can we now see the impact of some of these supply chain shifts over the last year or two because of the tariffs? And this is a diagram that attempts to show what's been happening in supply chains. If you go back to 1996, what you see here is that America imported approximately 45% of its manufacturing products from Asia. And approximately 15% of that, 8%, came from China. All the rest came from other Asian economies. And then in 2001, when China joined WTO, it was still like 1/4 of Asia's exports of manufactured products to the United States came from China, but 3/4 came from the other countries, principally Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. That was WTO. China joins. It becomes the assembly plant of the world. By 2009, global financial crisis, you can see that China's share becomes the majority share, and it's assembling all these parts and components produced elsewhere, sending it to the United States. But interestingly enough, America's imports of manufactured products over the last 20, 30 years has always stayed within a very narrow range between 40 and 46%. It hasn't changed. What has changed is how much of it is actually shipped directly from Beijing or China, and how much it comes from other Asian economies. Even up to 2018, that pattern did not change at all. Basically, China is accounting for the bulk of these manufactured imports. This was the view that China was dominating trade, and there was unfair competition, and there was a major bilateral trade deficit with China. The tariffs in 2019 on about $370 million of China's products coming to the United States started to cause a shift, and you see it in the last bar, a decline in China's share of manufactured exports to the United States, an increase in the share coming from other Asian economies, but overall, a decline in manufactured imports from Asia generally. And that is going to Mexico, it's going to Europe, it's going to other countries. Let me just spend the last few minutes about what's going to happen in the future. And first of all, President Trump will ratchet up economic tensions with China in the run-up to the elections. China's more aggressive diplomatic gestures have triggered more negative global sentiments. The pandemic exacerbating these trends. The trade war is going to intensify, and you're going to see more pressures for decoupling and restructuring of supply chains. Let me stop here.
Okay. Yeah, so Yukon, thank you very much. We got one question for you here, and then we'll turn to Alex. Yukon, you indicated that in the measure of technological adoption intensity, China shot up in the 1980s, rocketing ahead of South Korea, Russia, India, and Brazil. Then it leveled off, stagnated in the early 2000s. What's happened since then? Has their adoption intensity accelerated again, or is it still kind of at the same level it was before?
Well, let me again go back to the definition. What the World Bank did was study technologies which were developed in the United States and Europe, then ask the question, when did these technologies become used in production and exports in developing countries? And the lag takes about 10 to 15 years. In many cases, countries don't adopt it at all. They never get this technology, they never use it. So they found that starting from the early 80s onwards, China's ability to do this was enormous, much higher than they've ever seen. And it's basically continued. And actually I would say accelerated slightly, but it's more or less moderated because it was already so high. So the question today is these restrictions. If you restrict the exports of these technologies, if you prevent American companies from investing in China, if you prevent China from buying or investing in the United States, will this intensity index or measurement decline? And the answer, it takes time for this to show up. Now, in some sense, it may be ironic, because if China becomes more independent, if it actually is able to establish these technologies itself, it may be able to be self-sufficient. But that self-sufficiency, if it even is possible, probably would not show up for another 4, 5, or 6, 7 years. So we just don't know now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And we'll have more questions for Yukon in just a little bit. If you have a question, you can send it in by text, or you can raise your hand, and then we will call on you and turn the mic over to you. But we have with us next Alex Capri, who is a Heinrich Foundation Research Fellow and a visiting Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore Business School. He's written extensively on techno-nationalism and the U.S.-China tech war, including an analysis he's going to talk about right now about the semiconductor sector. It is almost 11 p.m. in Singapore. Alex has been teaching this evening. His class ended at 10 o'clock, and then he immediately turned to us. So I want to thank you very much for staying with us late this evening, Alex. And I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about semiconductors and some of your other research.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Yukon, for the landscape layout there. So let me just lay out how I'm going to spend my next 8-9 minutes talking about what techno-nationalism means for the semiconductor sector, but more broadly in U.S.-China relations, trade relations, as well as the global commercial business landscape in general. I would say that the way I've defined techno-nationalism is it's essentially the linkage between a country's level of innovation and its enterprises and how those bolster national security, economic strength. But I would add, and this is very important, and this is a key issue going forward for China, the US, and China versus the West, ideology. Ideology is manifest in technology, or I would put it another way. The way technology is used, i.e. for things like censorship, surveillance, monitoring, etc., is now going to become a major factor when we talk about export controls and restricted entity lists, etc., for the use of American and Western technology by Chinese companies. So those would be the three things. Now, I would say that Huawei, and I'm sure everybody's very familiar with Huawei, represents the perfect microcosm of this US-China techno-nationalist issue. It's the perfect microcosm because all of those three areas that I've just mentioned are manifest in the business footprint and the geopolitical footprint of Huawei. And if you, for those of you who may be familiar with this, there was this so-called Section 301 report under the Trade Act of 1974, which listed, not very well quantitatively, but listed the key areas that were the most problematic when dealing with the state-centric sort of state capitalist system of China and its systemic differences with the US and the West, which have now become a real problem now that China is 18, 19%, pushing 20% of global GDP. And those were forced technology transfer, essentially, sort of vague, very somewhat pernicious licensing laws that allowed for local companies to be able to make very, very small adjustments to Western technology and thereby claim that as their own technology. The portion that I think is going to be the most significant going forward, and this is where we're going to see a shift of attention, is going to be the economic subsidies and the economic support that companies like Huawei have been getting. And I think we're going to see a range of countermeasures put out by the U.S., which will go beyond export controls and so on. And then, of course, the last area that Huawei has been accused of is, and this is the one that we're hearing the most about, and this is cybersecurity. That's somehow, if Huawei 5G systems are and infrastructure is built, that somehow the Chinese Communist Party will be able to access data and will be able to spy. There's been no evidence that this is true, at least publicly, but I think that's going to be a moot point anyway, because I think we're going to come back to the economic side of things much more so when we start looking at economic techno-nationalism. So this brings us to semiconductors and why semiconductors have become so important in this so-called techno-nationalist jousting contest that we have going on. And it's very, very simple. A semiconductor is the single most important technology for any industry of the future, for any emerging and foundational industry, and anything that's going to be important in furthering both hard and soft power for any country is going to be driven first and foremost by semiconductors. As Chris mentioned, I've done a comprehensive report on this. Please take a look at that. Also have a report coming out tomorrow on decoupling, strategic decoupling in the tech sector with China. So if you look at China's the Made in China 2025 plan, there are 10 key industries that they have targeted. Semiconductors are number one, and then you've got autonomous vehicles, robotics, and others. Not one of those industries can advance without semiconductors. So what we have, what we have playing out now is we have a situation where we have US companies which are dominant in the semiconductor field. They're way ahead. As Yukon mentioned, they have a huge market in China, but the flip side to that is China is way, way behind when it comes to semiconductors. They simply don't have the capabilities to make leading edge chips and semiconductors. So, you know, some people would say that this Made in China 2025 plan is not really a plan to dominate, but it's an act of desperation to try and catch up. I think in many areas, at least based on my analysis, I think the level of sophistication of Chinese technology sectors might be a little bit overstated. But at the end of the day, the Achilles heel for any kind of Chinese advancement or development is semiconductors. And it's a big, big problem for China. So from a techno-nationalist perspective, the US has seized upon this, and they have essentially weaponized technology supply chains around semiconductors. They have, of course, put Huawei and a number of other critical Chinese companies on restricted entity lists, meaning that they cannot access this technology without special permission, or in some cases, they can't get it at all. So a couple of things I'll highlight. And again, Huawei is at the center of this. The first is that, let's be honest. I mean, Yukon mentioned ZTE. ZTE was in deep, deep trouble because of the degree of American technology that went into their phones. There was a proposed 7-year ban, and it was Google and Intel and all the American companies, which represented about 35% of the value in one of those phones. They went back and lobbied the government and said, hey, you can't do this. The collateral damage is going to be really bad. It's going to hurt all of us. But I think with Huawei, it's going to be different. There's no question that the U.S. semiconductor industry is highly exposed. That if they're blocked out and cut out of the market based on U.S. Sanctions and controls, they're going to lose market share. There's no question about that. The Chinese are going to double down on their efforts to de-Americanize their supply chains. There's no question about that. But what's interesting about that is this is a little bit different. You know, you throw in the COVID-19 pandemic and how that exposed an over-reliance on Chinese supply chains to begin with in key strategic industries. And you look at what the U.S. has just done to block TSMC from producing chips for HiSilicon, which is a subsidiary of Huawei, and it is an absolute a potential death blow. I mean, it is if HiSilicon cannot obtain its 5 nanometer chips for its 5G infrastructure and even for smartphones, that is going to be a major, major blow and possibly an existential threat to Huawei. So what we've seen now is in the last 3 weeks or so, we had the US changing the foreign direct product rule, which now says that even for foreign-made products of any kind, if they've got US technology in them, you cannot sell that product, period, to a restricted entity. So for Huawei, this was a big blow because TSMC, which is the world's largest subcontractor, it's a foundry. In other words, it makes chips. Most of its clients are American, by the way. They're the supplier. And so they use American manufacturing equipment. American companies control almost 60% of the market there. And they use designs and software where American companies control about 90% of the market. So it's a chokehold. It's an absolute chokehold. So the question is, what happens? Where do we go from here? Well, we're already seeing that we're in a period now of strategic decoupling. It doesn't mean that the entire trade relationship between China and the US is going to decouple. What it does mean is there will be specific, strategic, sensitive industries, all of which are going to be on the dual use list, meaning that it's technology that doubles as both commercial and military technology, which is pretty much everything today, you know, cutting edge technologies. There are going to be very key specific decouplings there. One, because the Chinese have to do it because they can't remain exposed and vulnerable to the whims of U.S. politicians and get cut off at a critical time. So they will double down on their efforts, and they will speed up their efforts to try and develop things themselves or to go somewhere else outside of the U.S. to get their technology. So that's going to happen. We will see reshoring of key strategic industries, and we've seen that with TSMC. The United States got TSMC to agree to build a state-of-the-art fab in Arizona, which will produce exclusively for American customers, including the US military, because there were fears that as the relationship between TSMC and Huawei and other Chinese companies increased, that there would be potential espionage, sabotage of chips made in Taiwan. So they are moving. So this is an example of how, not only in the semiconductor industry, but in strategic industries, we will see some diversification, meaning, again, moving, ring fencing, and producing, creating new ecosystems for strategic and economic purposes. So the other thing is more broadly, the world, global value chains have been fragmenting anyway because of automation, because of national data laws, and so we've seen a fragmenting of global value chains even before this trade war and even before COVID-19. So now this is all accelerating. And finally, I would just say that there will always be an in China for China strategy because it's going to be such a key market. So if you're a big company and the Chinese market is important to you, you're going to have to spend the money and make the efforts to ring fence your in China operations, right? And we see this happening while at the same time, the world is fragmenting into regionalized and localized value chains, and you're going to have to start building, particularly if there are strategic issues around this. So the semiconductor industry, finally, I'll close with this. It's absolutely key. There's no question about it. But there's a China conundrum, what I'll call the China conundrum for all of these companies, semiconductor companies and other tech companies. The end game in Chinese industrial policy is to supplant these companies and to have Chinese companies make these products. That is the end game. That is the plan. So the game has been for American companies, as long as they have a technological, and foreign companies, as long as they have an edge, they can sell and make and produce and play in the Chinese sandbox, but try to keep 1 or 2 generations ahead. But let's assume that at some point, Chinese industry catches up. What happens to Intel? What happens to NVIDIA? And what happens to Micron and Broadcom and all these companies? They've got competitors, right? They've got competitors in China, and potentially they've got competitors overseas. So this is going to take me right back to the Huawei microcosm. This is why the US government is trying to crush Huawei, okay? And so the world is yes, there's going to be collateral damage, no question about it. There's going to be real problems with collaboration, and there's going to be redundancies. We're going to lose economies of scale in a lot of these industries. We won't have hyper-rationalized value chains because of these things. So at the heart of that will be semiconductors.
Okay. Right. So thank you very much, Alex. You did mention you were talking about the strategic decoupling going on right now. That's the focus of your report that's going to be coming out tomorrow. And that's called, it's from the Heinrich Foundation. It's called Strategic U.S.-China Decoupling in the Tech Sector. And you talked a bit about that, but that's officially will be coming out tomorrow. All of the registrants from this call will be sending you a link to that new report. That report and the semiconductor report are both extremely detailed and thoughtful, 60, 70 pages or something like that. So I would encourage you, the great background documents for you to have. So now let me give you a reminder for if you want to raise, we have one more speaker here, you want to raise your hand to ask a question, Then we'll work your question into the Q&A session as soon as Martin is done talking. Or you can send in a question via chat, and I will convey that to the panelists that way. But we're going to hear from Martin for about 10 minutes. Martin Rasser is a senior fellow in the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He previously worked on emerging technologies as a senior U.S. intelligence officer and for an AI startup. And he's going to kind of talk about kind of where the U.S. and other countries can and possibly should go from here to deal with the techno-nationalistic trend. I'll turn it over to Martin, who has a PowerPoint, so you can go ahead and share your screen now, Martin.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Alex and Yukon. It's a real pleasure to be here. So what I'll just focus my remarks on is, and I'll just be skimming the wave tops here in the interest of time, but the notion of a technology competition with China. And so that's part of the broader great power competition with China right now. And what I'll do for you, if I can, oh, there we go, there's the slide. Just walk through, talk about some areas where China is in a very strong position, in some cases actually the leader. But as Alex pointed out earlier as well, there's also important areas where China is behind, so they are lagging. And I'll talk a little bit about some policy recommendations, where the United States needs to invest, but then also what it should be doing in partnership with other leading technology powers, in particular the world's liberal democracies. And then we'll talk specifically about what this new grouping of technology powers could work on together in order to better position themselves for this technology competition. So China is a leader in several areas. I'd say they're at parity or perhaps even ahead in genomics, quantum science, and artificial intelligence. Quantum science is going to be very important for computing and encryption. Artificial intelligence, of course, will be entangled in almost everything we'll do. So these are some very fundamental technologies that will really drive the 21st century economy. In terms of R&D spending, in addition to what Yukon showed you about just their ability to absorb foreign technology, China is now truly innovating using their own knowledge. And in fact, from a purchasing power parity standpoint, China may have already surpassed the United States in terms of total R&D spending. Now, of course, another thing that China is very good at in terms of its political system is setting very ambitious scientific and technological milestones. And so this is very much a top-down strategy. It's not to say they always meet those goals, but there's very strong government support to pursue these very ambitious projects. And that's a great motivator for the country's companies and research institutes. Of course, China is behind. So Alex already mentioned semiconductors. That's a critical vulnerability that the Chinese government has been trying to rectify for decades now with little success, really. But even in technologies such as jet engines, this is an area where China is still not able to produce a high quality, cutting edge jet engine, either for commercial aircraft or for military aircraft, despite decades of investment, joint ventures with Western companies, and substantial investments. Now, part of this stems from just broader innovation shortfalls. So China ultimately has few world-class universities and research institutes, particularly compared to the United States. There's also the emphasis on patents. A lot of people point to the fact that China is, in many regards, now the leading patent requesting nation in the world, but I would point out that this is often a matter of quantity over quality. If you look at the actual, both the monetary and the technological value of these patents, China is still quite behind. And more fundamentally, the political system, as a closed authoritarian system, this typically isn't that conducive to innovation and scientific exchange. So here again, there are constraints what China's political system imposes on the overall innovation ecosystem. To respond, there's a few things the United States needs to do. And frankly, I think the United States has been rather complacent, particularly in the areas of R&D investments. So if you think back to the 60s and 70s, for example, particularly the US government was making a lot of investments in basic research, and these this research then resulted in technologies like the transistor, GPS, the internet. You know, these are the very technologies that are driving our economy today. So in the 60s and 70s, total US government spending on R&D was about 1.2% of GDP. Right now, it's only 0.7%. We really have to get back to that 1.2% target, because what's particularly important about US government investments in R&D is that the US government remains the biggest funder of basic R&D. And these are the early stages of research where the true breakthroughs happen. The private sector has spent a lot on R&D, but the incentive is to invest in applied research, and because really that's where you have a much higher guarantee of return on investment. So while overall US R&D spending has remained fairly constant as a percentage of GDP at about 2.8% over the past 2 decades or so, it's that shift where much more is being spent by the private sector. And that's a ratio that needs to shift back. And looking at the bigger picture, at 2.8% of GDP, we're really starting to fall behind. That target should be closer to 4%. If you look at countries like Israel and South Korea, they're spending well over that, almost 4.5%. And so we really need to jumpstart this innovation ecosystem again, because we're largely still coasting on scientific research breakthroughs that took place in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we need to get over that complacency and renew our competitive edge in that front. Another important area is human capital. So there's 2 components to that. There's American talent, so native-born Americans. Right now, we still face a dearth of STEM graduates, and that's been a long-standing problem. But so far, not much has been done to address this. Yes, there has been increases in STEM education, but we're still falling well short of the total number of STEM graduates that we need to enter the workforce. Some progress has been made under the Trump administration, some progress was made under the Obama administration, but we still need greater investments in not just educating our students, but also training our teachers to make sure that they have the skills to impart the knowledge that's needed. And of course, our universities and research institutes, more and more scientific research is dependent on computing resources, compute for short. Much of the United States computing resources are now concentrated in some of the very large tech firms. And this means that startup companies and universities in smaller cities have a hard time getting access to the amount of computing resources that they need to do their work. And so there have been some very interesting proposals out there to create a national compute resource, for example. That was a proposal that came out of Stanford. There's very broad support amongst the university regents and presidents and so forth. This is one way where we can address that shortfall and really democratize access to computing resources. The other important human capital aspect is international talent. We need immigration reform in the United States. And obviously this is an extremely contentious issue, particularly under the current administration. But the simple fact of the matter is, as I already mentioned, America doesn't produce enough high talent, high technology talent that is needed. And if you look at the actual numbers, immigrants and the children of immigrants have a disproportionate share of the number of startups they create, disproportionate share of the number of relevant patents that are produced. So foreign talent is truly critical to America being able to effectively compete. And I won't go into the details of the specific recommendations here, but at a high level, the cap on H-1B visas, which allows foreign talent to live and work in the United States, that cap has remained flat for many years. That needs to be raised or preferably eliminated altogether for graduate students. But we also need new pathways for talent to come in. And so I have a report. I'll share the link in the chat feature when I'm through here so you can read the details. And I'd be happy to follow up with you one-on-one if you want to talk about how we could put something like this in motion. Most importantly, what I want to talk about is a fresh approach to technology policy. And this really needs to be done on a multilateral basis, because right now, what US policy is largely built on is unilateral action or ad hoc bilateral action. So Alex mentioned semiconductors and specifically the more punitive steps being taken towards Huawei. But it's broader than that too, because we are seeing issues in artificial intelligence. I mentioned quantum computing. There's also the illiberal use of technologies such as surveillance technology being used in Xinjiang. That same technology is being exported around the world, where it's really bolstering autocratic regimes, which in and of itself is a threat to liberal democracies worldwide. So a project that I've been working on is laying out a blueprint for creating a new technology policy entity organization. The membership would be the G7 countries and countries like South Korea, the Netherlands, Australia, working together on a few areas of common interest in order to better coordinate technology policy with the ultimate goal of being more competitive. Now, the necessity for this is that no one country will be able to successfully compete with China, both just from a resource standpoint. No one has the scale of population, for example, that China can muster for these things. But more broadly, because just the diffusion of knowledge and our technology supply chains, there's no way for one single country to be able to impact those to the extent they would need to. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, China's achieving dominance in some very critical technologies. If China does successfully establish leadership in these areas, that's not just economic power, but you also have a lot of military and political power that flow from that. And I would argue that that's not in the interest of the world's liberal democracies to have that happen. So the ultimate purpose of this organization is to truly regain the initiative in the global technology competition. And that's through investments in R&D, for example, so joint research efforts in specific areas, semiconductors being a great example. But you also want to protect and preserve key areas of competitive technological advantage. And finally, as I mentioned, protecting and promoting collective norms and values about how these emerging technologies are used, because this is an increasing problem where you have suppression of populations, autocratic tendencies that are then being proliferated around the world, disinformation, cyber security threats. All these things need to be addressed, and we stand a much better chance of impacting those in a way that end up in our favor if we do that collectively. So a few areas through the project that I've been working on where I see common ground forming is, as mentioned, R&D, but supply chain diversity and security, and that particularly became of much greater interest during the pandemic crisis, standard setting in various technology areas, multilateral export controls, and finally countering the illiberal use of technologies. So some specific areas where you could work, rare earth elements, not as much discussion of that of late, but that still remains a critical vulnerability, not just for the United States, but for various countries around the world. We are heavily dependent on China for these critical elements, which are, just foundational to electronics, not just consumer electronics, but various defense systems, but also next generation growth industries such as renewable energy, like wind turbines, for example, require a lot of these materials. I mentioned export controls. So there's been a lot of focus on restricting semiconductors across the board, specifically to Huawei, but also a few other companies in China. What I would argue that a more effective approach would be focusing on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, because ultimately, without the equipment to make and design semiconductors, that's the linchpin. And so rather than denying China chipsets that go into mobile phones, if we focus our effort on the manufacturing equipment, we make it very difficult for China to be able to indigenize semiconductor manufacturing to begin with. These are very complex, hard to use machines that require a lot of know-how. And again, I would say it's not in any American company's interest to have China be able to indigenize this, because ultimately they'll be driven out of business. But in order for this to be effective, it has to be done on a multilateral basis, because the other companies that make these devices are primarily located in Japan and the Netherlands. So working collectively, these countries can have a huge impact on China's future abilities in this area. Now, of course, you need a more affirmative approach at the same time. If you're asking Western companies to not sell to China, which is a very important and growing market for all these companies, you also need to provide some alternative sources of revenue. And one thing I would propose here is an international fab consortium. Because semiconductor fabrication is expensive, a new facility costs anywhere from $10 to $20 billion, depending on the type of equipment that's used. It's a very daunting expense for any single company or single country to diversify the supply chain by setting up a new fab. So again, pooling resources here to diversify the supply chain, opening up new fabrication lines, and it could be in other allied countries, doesn't necessarily have to be in the United States. You can imagine one in France, for example, one in Australia, but just to have that resiliency in the supply chain so you're not so heavily dependent on China or Taiwan as your source for semiconductors. And finally, of course, since we mentioned Huawei, one area in 5G that holds a lot of promise is shifting the makeup of the industry altogether. Because even if you can successfully keep Huawei out of 5G networks, you still face the fact that the industry as a whole is an oligopoly. Other than Huawei, the market is nearly entirely dominated by Nokia, Ericsson, and to a lesser extent, Samsung. That's still not a healthy competitive environment. But there's some new technological breakthroughs that could break open that legacy way of doing business. And by focusing on open architecture, which means that the proprietary systems that dominate the market now are set aside, you can invite software companies to build a whole new ecosystem for telecommunications infrastructure. Happy to talk about that more in detail if anyone's interested, but I think I'll stop here in the interest of time because I want to make sure that we have plenty of opportunity for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, so our viewers out there, raise your hand so you can ask an audio question. We have some text chat questions in. I'll be reading those out. I have one question for Alex. This is from your semiconductor report. You write about the National IC Plan. Can you maybe give us a sense exactly what is that and how are they supporting that?
Well, it's a massive fund essentially, so Chinese techno policy for years now has been divided into two forks. One is to attract a very, very specific FDI through bringing that technology in and through joint ventures and partnerships. The other is to go out and acquire it. So, a lot of the money from these funds goes to, state-owned companies or proxies that then go out and acquire that. That has been pretty much shut down. I think Yukon mentioned the CFIUS action. And it's not just being shut down in the States, but the Europeans have shut that down as well. So those are the primary reasons for the fund. But I think Martin had some really, really good points. I mean, I'm assuming we're going to have a lot of questions. If we don't, I'd love to ask some questions to the other panelists, but let's go and see what else you've got in terms of questions.
Okay, well, we have one from Mark Cohen from Berkeley Law. On what basis can we definitely conclude that China is at parity or in the lead in genomics, quantum science, et cetera? Seems to be that one of the regrettable characteristics of the current momentum is a paucity of reliable information on China's technological accomplishments. And Martin, you kind of talked about that, but any of the panelists, I mean, how much do we actually know about what China has and doesn't have?
Well, it's an inexact science, of course. It's hard to quantify the specifics, but a lot of these assessments are based on reviews of the scientific literature. So that's a decent gauge of what types of research they're doing, the types of advances they're making. Specifically for artificial intelligence, the Chinese are ahead of the United States in deploying certain types of artificial intelligence systems. So if you look at the surveillance-driven technologies such as facial recognition, for example, these are actively being used, not just for the social credit system in China, but I also mentioned the concentration camps in Xinjiang. So we can see firsthand what they're doing. We've got a pretty good handle of what the Chinese are doing in terms of unmanned systems. So there's a fair amount out there. But yes, it's not an exact thing to say they're ahead or they're at parity. It's an approximation, but by and large, scientists and researchers in the fields agree that that is the case.
Okay. Another question, I think, Alex, maybe you can handle this one from Sebastian Moss. What are the major companies behind semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and what power, if any, does the U.S. government have over their export? So can you maybe give us the rundown of what companies are involved, and what can the U.S. administration do about their exports?
Well, so there's a handful. There's Broadcom, Micron. There's Intel, which is a vertically integrated company. There's NVIDIA, for example. There's Marvell Tech. There's a whole list. So U.S. semiconductor companies make up about 50+% of the global market for semiconductors. And then, of course, you have Samsung, which is a huge player. And then you have TSMC, which is a foundry, right? It's a customized foundry, and you have TSMC manufacturing about 60% of the world's subcontracted chips. So it's a mass, and they're a leading edge organization. They're pushing the envelope in terms of innovation. But as Martin mentioned earlier, the U.S. has an absolute chokehold on manufacturing equipment. And yes, there are, so these are the very, very hyper-specialized machines that are used, the tooling machines, the machines that go into producing commercial level, high yield wafers and chips. It is, I would argue that producing a commercial level, high yield commercial chips in large quantities is an accomplishment far greater than going to the moon. I think that the state-of-the-art semiconductor production is probably the zenith of human technological achievement. I mean, it's right up there. So that's why it's so hard to do. So what can the US government do with these companies? So again, it's a conundrum because the US doesn't have a long-term plan, right? The current administration doesn't really have a long-term plan. And this is where, again, there has to be planning for more R&D, for more production, for next generations of innovation, and for being able to create new markets that may not necessarily be in China, right? for new products. So at this point in time, the U.S. government has tremendous power to implement restricted entity lists and export controls, which does a lot of damage, right? Short term, it does a lot of damage, and there's a lot of collateral damage. But there has to be a mid to long-term plan here. And part of that, again, is I think what Martin mentioned, and that is, forming these consortiums, these public-private partnerships. We're seeing this happening already, with EU-US cooperation on the EU-US AI initiative and many others. So I think we'll see more of that going forward.
Okay. So we have a question from David Nicholas, who's a business columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. David, we're unmuting you, and so you can ask your question, David. Welcome.
Okay. Primarily for Martin, but maybe the other panelists have a thought as well. If there's such an obvious incentive for the world's democracies to get together and talk about some of these issues, and the issues have been apparent for a long time, why hasn't that happened? What are the stumbling blocks or the obstacles that are that sort of preventing the U.S. and its allies from getting their act together on these issues?
Yeah, that's an important question. Part of it is, well, technology policy is very difficult. And up until now, I would argue that each country, not only has each country looked at technology policy issues as really a national issue, as opposed to a multinational one. There's also the problem that governments have been approaching all these various technology policy issues as silos. Mm-hmm. So, 5G one day, AI the other day, quantum computing the next day. Well, I would argue that we need to look at all these technology fields as being much more interrelated than we have been up to now, because there's no single way that we can impact, so if the US policy outcomes for 5G and Huawei, for example, you can't divorce that, as Alex pointed out, from the broader issue of semiconductors. You can't divorce that from the broader issue of just high technology supply chains generally. And so if we take a more holistic view of all these issues, it'll become easier not just to find the value and reason for cooperating in that, but it's also easier then to find solutions that are less damaging to our respective business interests as well. Because, as Alex and Yukon pointed out, you don't want to hurt your own industry in the process of doing so. And by taking multilateral approaches on this, not only can you do the restrictive aspects like the export controls, but then you can also focus on the affirmative steps to help offset the results of limiting sales, for example.
Okay. So if we have any other questions out there, raise your hands and we'll work your question in. I have another question. I guess this is for anybody on the panel. Any comment on the open source RISC-V project that recently migrated from California to Switzerland, apparently to avoid U.S. export controls? I don't have a background in that topic, so is this something one of you might want to take a crack at?
Let me just take a quick crack at that.
Sure.
So there was a rule that many would consider a loophole in U.S. export control law, which was called the de minimis rule, which essentially said that something was a U.S. technology and therefore became liable or fell under the umbrella of U.S. export controls if a certain percentage of that foreign-made finished product was of U.S. origin, right? So there was a 25% and there was a 10% threshold. Some have 0. So what companies did and this is why Huawei, when it was initially put on the restricted entity list, instructed all of its suppliers immediately recalibrate your supply chains to get under the de minimis levels. And so what they've done is they simply move costs out of the US, overhead, labor costs, whatever, so you can manipulate that overall percentage of US technology to below the de minimis threshold. So what's happened now, though, is that the US Department of Commerce has tweaked this foreign direct product rule, which used to allow for companies to shift production out or to go through third parties and therefore then ship to restricted entities and not be subject to a license. What's happened now is they've said there is no de minimis. If you ship, you need a license, period, if there's any technology. And this is what's happening with TSMC, with the manufacturing equipment and the design equipment. So it's become far more draconian, and it's essentially eliminated that loophole. So we just need to wait and see whether or not through lobbying efforts, which is essentially, I think this is Huawei's best hope, is that the US industry will lobby the Trump administration and get them to walk back their threats and so forth and so on. So that would be my response to that, Chris.
Okay.
Hey, Chris?
Yeah, Yukon?
Can I get in here?
Sure.
To make a comment, and also in reference to previous comments here. The predicament we face is that GDP growth, economic growth everywhere, essentially depends upon productivity increases linked to technological innovation. And that innovation and technological link is greater for America than it is for China. So America grows, let's say 1.5%, 2% a year. That's very high. Probably more than half of that is due to its innovative technological progress. Now, if you restrict America's exports and investment in these high-tech areas because you don't want China to have access, you reduce an enormous percentage of America's innovative capacity to grow and develop. So that's why the US Defense Department has some qualms against restricting the export of high-tech to China, because it believes that it actually may lower America's ability to defend its security interests in the long term. Now, the IMF did a study. It basically showed that in the short term, these kinds of restrictions hurt China more than America, these trade and some of these investment restrictions. But in the long term, America actually suffers more. Its growth rate could fall down to 0.5% 4 or 5 years down the line because it loses its market. China could still grow, let's say no longer at 5 or 6, but could grow at 3 to 4 because of these restrictions. So it's all relative. Everyone loses. But the second point I would make is the following. We see this technological transfer, techno-nationalism, as a zero-sum game. Either America wins or China wins, not that both sides can win. Over the last 15, 20 years, global growth has increased by 50%. And that's been beneficial to everybody. And the primary reason is that countries like China and developing world have been able to get technology and innovation from the West, and therefore the growth rate has surged. If we now start to restrict it, we restrict their growth potential, where we ultimately restrict America's. And the second point I'd like to make is we tend to over-exaggerate China's superiority or advancement in high-tech areas. There are certain areas in AI or quantum computing that China's good at, and other areas that America's good at. As Alex has mentioned, semiconductors, China's really far behind. If you think about it, China cannot make a globally competitive car. It can make a globally competitive high-speed rail, but not a car. And the reason why, it's too sophisticated, okay? If China makes globally competitive drones, only because it has access to American semiconductors. If it didn't have access to it, it couldn't make them. So we have to remember that it's so apparently technological advancement is in some ways illusory. Why is it that Apple produces everything in China? okay? And you would think that would be the easiest way to steal it or for China to copy it. But Apple still does that. How does Apple do that and still maintain its technological capacity? Because it basically changes and innovates every single year. Intel produces and does research in China. At the same time, they've had this worry about semiconductors. And how does Intel compete? It competes by staying ahead of the game, and frankly speaking, by keeping some of its most advanced semiconductor research in the United States and elsewhere. So the actual point is, do we go for closed systems or do we go for open systems? For example, if we need to deal with technology, regulate technology, as Martin mentioned, do we actually say that it should be restricted only to the West? Or do we actually say, here are rules of the game, what we want to achieve, and China, do you want to be part of this? Because if you are part of this, you're going to be regulated. But if you're not part of this, you're going to go your rogue way. And that's what I would say. We actually should have these kinds of arrangements. But the trick is to actually say to China, you need to be part of this rather than say you should be outside of this. And then the question for China is, am I willing to do so? And that's the big tricky issue right now.
Okay, so we need to wrap this up in just a minute or so. I do have a question about how reporters can best cover this issue and background themselves on it. So this is to all three of you, but if you could maybe just give me one or two quick thoughts on this. How can reporters best stay on top of this issue? Which agencies or which entities of the Commerce Department or CFIUS or the others that should journalists become familiar with so they can understand what's going on in this issue, and which members of Congress are kind of most involved in a leadership capacity on this? We'll start with you, Yukon. Just a name or two of the people or entities that journalists should pay attention to. You need to unmute yourself, Yukon.
I think the problem is that there's no simple way of keeping abreast of what's going on, because the views from the Treasury, for example, the Commerce Department, Defense Department, the security establishment, they actually are quite different. They have different motivations. That's part of the problem. When you review and try to deal with the question of who's ahead and who's not ahead, there are studies that try to differentiate, but they're not consistent. I think if you talk to economists and you talk to security people, they have different answers to this question. My own feeling for the journalists, which have a huge problem trying to address this, unfortunately, the mess out there means you have to actually look at a variety of sources, and you have to sometimes strike a balance between this. And this is not going to be easy.
Okay, Martin, same question. Any entities or congressional leaders who are journalists should acquaint themselves with?
Yeah, absolutely. On the Huawei 5G issue, Department of State Deputy Assistant Secretary Rob Strayer is, tip of the spear when it comes to promoting U.S. policy on the issue and engaging with allies and partners. So I would highly recommend him. And then for broader technology issues, particularly when it comes to the competition with China on the Republican side, I would recommend Senator Hawley from Missouri. And on the Democratic side, Senator Warner of Virginia.
Okay. And Alex, same question for both U.S. sources and entities as well as global ones?
Yeah, so keep a close eye on the Federal Register. I mean, the U.S. is a very transparent democracy, and any laws that are coming out having anything to do with export controls or restricted entity lists, dual-use technologies, they're all going to be published. You have the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, which is part of the Department of Commerce, that enforces that. You have the Department of State, they all have fantastic resources, websites. It's all there available to you, and get yourself a bot to collect all the news. Figure out how to funnel it all into your bucket.